Coming up.
The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Mr. Chief Justice, you know better.
Affirmative action breaks down structures of white privilege,
sowing backlash and resentment in the process.
We can't let a little resentment close the doors of opportunity.
Affirmative action may open doors for some, but it slams them shut for others.
Abigail Fisher's suit against the University of Texas at Austin argues that affirmative action denied her a place at the school, violating her constitutional rights.
Does affirmative action undermine the achievements of those who are supposed to benefit from it?
There are those who contend that it does not benefit African Americans to get them into the University of Texas, where they do not do well, as opposed to having them go to a less advanced school.
Is affirmative action too little or too much?
Our guest is Glenn Loury, author of The Anatomy of Racial Inequality.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're here at the studios of KALW San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner at Stanford, where Ken teaches philosophy, and I did for 40 years.
40 memorable years, John. Now today, we're thinking about affirmative action and asking, is it too little or too much?
Well, too little or too much what, Ken?
Well, too little racial injustice or perhaps too much racial resentment.
Well, maybe a bit of both. Affirmative action, as originally conceived, was a good thing, in my opinion. It was designed to overcome the effects of past racial discrimination when blacks were often told they need not apply.
Yeah, John, but why the need for it still? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in one fell swoop, didn't it?
Oh, you're so naive, Ken. You think if the law says there shall be no further discrimination, then it will disappear? That you can't undo the lingering effects of decades and decades of racial injustice with a mere stroke of a pen. That's where affirmative action came in.
Yeah, John, but how is suddenly subjecting whites to what many think of as reverse discrimination supposed to help with that? Surely you don't believe that two racial wrongs make a racial right.
Well, reverse discrimination was never the idea. At least it was the original idea. The point was to level a playing field. Institutions had to act affirmatively to make sure that they were reaching candidate pools that they may have been excluding for years, that included minorities, and that they were using criteria that weren't unnecessarily biased. The idea was to actively seek out minorities and to remove obstacles, to openly welcome them, and to allow them to compete, but on a fair and equal terms with whites.
Well, that's maybe how they thought of it then, but that's not how people think of affirmative action today, John. Not at all. They think of it as a system where whites and blacks are not held to the same standards, and you get a less qualified black person being hired or admitted over a more qualified white person, all in the name of some ideal of diversity.
Admittedly, affirmative action did evolve. It started out, as I described, a tool for eliminating the effects of past discrimination. It became more a tool for increasing diversity directly, at least somewhat independently of explicit discrimination.
I'm not quite sure I see the difference you're getting at.
Well, one is focused on fair and open processes, making sure that they're not infected with bias. The other is focused more on actual results.
Well, I see that's a fair distinction. I grant you that's a fair distinction. I'm not sure it makes much of a difference in actual practice, though.
Well, the second is harder to justify. It's a philosophically different stance. It's bound to encounter resentment and resistance from some.
Why? That's because you don't think diversity is a good thing?
Well, diversity is a very good thing, but so is individual merit.
Is there supposed to be some tension between diversity and merit?
Well, if there weren't a tension, then we could just focus on fairly evaluating merit and let diversity take care of itself.
I'm not so sure about that. Look, what if we were given two equally qualified candidates, one of whom adds diversity and the other doesn't? Shouldn't we go with a more diverse candidate?
Nice hypothetical, but are there really any ties in real life?
Well, why should diversity only be used to break ties anyway? I think maybe we should question that assumption. Why can't diversity be a positive qualification all on its own?
So you get extra points for being a black or being a woman? That seems to me to go against the very idea of equality. it needs to be done very carefully. It really does amount to reverse discrimination.
I'm not so sure about that either. Think of it in the context of implicit bias, John. People have done this kind of experiment a lot. Suppose we give two hiring committees two almost identical resumes with just this one teeny tiny inconsequential difference. One person has a recognizably Anglo-sounding name, say Jason. The other has a recognizably African-American sounding name, I don't know, say Jamal. Shouldn't make a difference, should it?
No. What's in a name?
Well, but you and I both know the dirty little secret that it does matter. In experiment after experiment like this, the candidate with the black-sounding name is judged to be less qualified than the candidate with the Anglo-sounding name. And it's the same for female names, same for Hispanic names.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of research on that. Being John instead of Joan, same term paper, third of a point grade average, better in most cases. That's why over at Berkeley, where I'm doing some teaching now, we just have students identify themselves by numbers. But people used to hope that if we just had fair procedures and standards and actively sought out excluded people, everything would eventually be all right. We might not need affirmative action anymore. But you're kind of suggesting with all this stuff that implicit bias will never overcome discrimination. That's pretty depressing, Ken.
Well, it's a fact, John. I mean, people prefer their own kind. And even when they think they don't, even when they think of themselves as fair-minded, open-minded people, they in fact aren't. It is depressing.
Well, how can we ever be sure that we aren't being controlled by our biases and that we're honestly applying fair, equitable, and objective standards?
I'm not sure that we can, John. That's the point.
Well, that's terrific, Ken. Where does that leave us? With endless debates, lawsuits, and racial division?
Nobody ever promised that achieving racial justice was going to be easy, John.
Well, and to give us a feel for just how challenging the achievement of racial justice can be, we sent our roving philosophical reporter, Shuka Kalantari, to look at affirmative action. Then and now she files this report.
It all began in 1961. When President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order requiring government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure equal opportunity in the workplace and in higher education.
And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select, without having to be backed up by troops.
Affirmative action was first challenged successfully in the courts in 1978. The Supreme Court ruled states could not set quotas for the number of minority students they enrolled. Fast forward a quarter century, and there are two Supreme Court cases against different schools at the University of Michigan.
White applicants had sued the university, saying that applicants of color who were less qualified than they had been accepted while they had been rejected.
Faye Crosby is a psychology professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
And they said that this goes against the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that says that we need to consider every individual as an individual, not as a member of some caste or category.
The University of Michigan argued that the role of a public university is to benefit the public good and provide a full education. And getting a full education entails being in contact with people from different ethnicities, hearing their points of view, and learning how to work with them.
It essentially boils down to the following. In Michigan, a largely white state, the white students would be harmed if they would not be in contact with students from underrepresented minority groups.
The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the law school, saying it's constitutional for a program to consider race in admissions as part of a larger decision process. But the court ruled against the undergraduate school, saying that giving an automatic boost to minorities in admissions was unconstitutional.
If you read the decisions, you see that it's the same logic. You have to look at every individual applicant on his or her combination of merits, and then sort of stand back and say, how have we done? Do we have a diversified student body?
In 2013, in the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas, the Supreme Court ruled colleges have to show they're using race in admissions only when necessary, meaning there are no other methods that could produce the same results. Today, 9 states, including California, have eliminated affirmative action from their public universities. One effect in California is that the number of minority students doesn't reflect the state's ethnic profile.
Where we're really having trouble is with African American students.
A 2014 study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that African American student rates at the law schools of UC Berkeley and UCLA dropped from 61 to 31% after affirmative action was eliminated.
We need to be much more vigilant about continuing to be a ladder of opportunity for all students, including especially African American students.
UC Santa Cruz psychologist Faye Crosby says affirmative action inspires people to pay it forward. In one study, the former presidents of Princeton and Harvard tracked students of color who had been admitted to top East Coast universities through affirmative action.
Those individuals later on devoted themselves to public service more so than any other category. They helped with education and with public works in their local communities.
Crosby says affirmative action isn't the whole answer for racial equality in higher education, but it's part of the answer. And it's a part that ripples across the whole pond because it creates better educated people of color who have a commitment to justice for all ethnicities and racial groups. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Shuka Kalantari.
Thanks, Shuka, for that fascinating report. I'm John Perry. With me is my fellow Stanford philosopher, Ken Taylor.
And today, we're thinking about affirmative action and asking whether it's too little or too much. We're joined now by Glenn Loury. He's a professor of economics at Brown University, who, I just learned, has been appointed a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Society, a very, very big honor. He also has perhaps the lesser honor of being a fellow at Stanford Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, and he's the author of The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. Glenn, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Hello, Ken. Welcome. Thank you for welcoming me.
So, Glenn, you're an economist. You do a lot of technical, groundbreaking work in economics full of equations and stuff like that.
Right.
But you're here because you also have not just the interest we all have in affirmative action, but a real academic interest in that too. So what led to this interest in affirmative action as an academic thing worth an economist's time?
I'll say 2 things, John. One of them is you cannot be black, and I am black, and not be affected in some way by affirmative action. And as a social scientist, I want not only to experience this policy in my own life, but to also try to understand it in some more rigorous way. And the other thing is that affirmative action is complicated. It turns out that it's not, if you will, a straightforward and black and white matter. It's a subject that can be illuminated by the methods of economic reasoning, and I've tried to do that in my technical research.
Well, as your answer suggests, and as I know from a little exposure to your work, you have a rather nuanced view on affirmative action.
Nice of you to notice.
But let's start with what there is to be said on behalf of it. It's been over 50 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Today, in today's terms, what's the best argument to be made for affirmative action?
There are a number, but I think the very best one comes down to there are many circumstances in which the legitimacy of public institutions turns on their representativeness. And sadly, perhaps, even now in the 21st century, racial identity is an important part of what it means for an institution to be representative. Let me just give one example, the United States Supreme Court. Justice Clarence Thomas is black. He was appointed when Justice Thurgood Marshall stepped away. It's hard to avoid the thought that George Herbert Walker Bush, President of the United States in 1991, appointed a black person to the Supreme Court to replace Justice Thurgood Marshall because he and others understood that American institutions would have been severely weakened had there been no black on the court. I'm not trying to discredit Justice Thomas in observing this.
I understand that you're not trying to discredit Justice Thomas, but replacing Marshall with Thomas as a way of preserving the kind of racial integrity of the court is a little bizarre, since that's the yin and the yang of jurisprudence, right? I mean,
and it's ironic as well because Thomas is dead set against affirmative action, and yet his appointment is an example of it, I would say, again, without any discredit intended toward him.
Right. I mean, I get the concern that I mean, if you had said police forces,
well, I could have.
I would have been more convinced.
The governor of a state can't appoint people to the bench when there's a vast overrepresentation of people of color in prison, and when the judges in the state are sending people to prison. You can't have a judicial cadre that is entirely lily white,
right,
and a set of people in the dock being judged by them who are all black and brown.
See, I would have said, though, so the difference between the police force case and the Supreme Court is really striking because one, appointing black police officers preserves the integrity of the police force in a way that trading Thomas for Thurgood Marshall doesn't quite. I mean, because of the difference in their judicial philosophy. But we can get to that.
But I can give other examples. I mean, a company can't do business in a diverse marketplace without attending to the composition of its workforce and so on.
And we can't be on the radio without breaks.
Yeah, and you're listening to Philosophy Talk. Our topic this week, affirmative action. Is it too little or too much?
In our next segment, we'll take a critical look at affirmative action. It's been denounced as a form of reverse discrimination. Have you been affected by affirmative action? Did it help or hurt?
The rights and the wrongs of affirmative action, plus your calls and emails when Philosophy Talk continues.
Do you hear me now? I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Open up the door. I'll get it myself.
Affirmative action opens doors for many people, but does it devalue the work of others who could open those doors themselves? I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, and we're thinking about affirmative action and asking whether it's too little or too much.
Our guest is Glenn Loury from Brown University, author of The Anatomy of Racial Inequality.
So, Glenn, obviously you're versed in the defenses of affirmative action, and we're going to get into that more. But, you've also said some I think they're jarring claims about it. For example, I read somewhere that you said affirmative action is patronizing and ironic. I'm not quite sure what either of those characterizations mean, so let's start out. You pick the one you want to start with, either the patronizing part or the ironic part.
Well, they're connected. Let me start with the ironic part. So here you have affirmative action, which is an egalitarian policy. We're trying to equalize. And yet it only comes up when we're rationing positions, which is to say when we're in an environment of inegalitarianism. Affirmative action is parasitic on hierarchy. It's not a leveling policy. It levels or endeavors to level across groups while maintaining and sustaining hierarchic arrangements within groups. That I find to be ironic. Let me just mention one other thing, if I may.
Okay, sure.
We want to be an enlightened society in which a person's race is not such an important feature of their character, of how we assess them. And yet, by employing affirmative action within the context of selective institutions, we make the race of people within those institutions informative, because indirectly we announce to everybody that the members of the preferred group have been selected by a different set of criteria. It's foolish to think that people are going to ignore that reality in their subsequent dealings with those people.
Okay, let's slow down. I mean, I think that's a thick thought, and I want to see if I can sink my teeth into it. I mean, so when we use affirmative action, I can see the point, I think. If we're thinking about affirmative action at your institution, my institution, Stanford, Brown, Yale, Harvard, right? These bastions of the elite that consolidate and perpetuate the elite. And we're saying, we're going to use this criterion to decide membership in the elite. It's parasitic on, it doesn't do anything to break down those elite structures. It kind of just gets new people into those. If I'm talking about a police force as opposed to a university, I'm not quite sure the same.
Okay, it's not the same. And I'm thinking of environments that are highly selective in a way that a police force would not necessarily be. And absolutely, it doesn't and can't undermine the fundamental hierarchic thing that's going on, which is the meritocratic selection of persons with intellectual performance that justifies them being in this kind of an environment. But the thing is, the currency of the realm in these environments, the Stanfords and the Browns and the Caltechs and the MITs, is outstanding intellectual performance. That's what really matters. You put minority students, however, when they've been selected by different criteria in those very high-pressured environments where their currency is their identity. It's their genitalia. It's their skin color. So that has to be a substitute for intellectual performance?
Well, but when I first got into this business in the late 60s, I was put on various committees at UCLA, and it was explained to us what affirmative action was. And it wasn't what people have in mind now at all. It was simply, look, we got to get the word out about our admission processes to schools that we've been ignoring. We've got to go over our criteria and make sure that the things we're requiring aren't just holdovers from the past. That was affirmative action. Act affirmatively to make sure that everybody gets a shot at it. Did that not work, or did we drift into this more unequal treatment concept of affirmative action, or was it a principled decision because the leveling the playing field just wasn't working?
It did work. That focus on recruitment and outreach, that reflexive examination of how are we conducting our selection processes. Let's make sure we're really not stuck in some old boys network. Let's open ourselves. That did work. It worked so well that it's become second nature to most selective organizations. We don't even have to discuss it anymore. You could call it, if you like, weak affirmative action. It worked, but it didn't work well enough because it didn't produce the numerical outcomes that political demands seem to require. So if I have an institution with 3% African Americans in its ranks in a polity where demographically African Americans are 12% of the population, it would still be said not to be representative, even if the 3% would have been 1% without the adoption of these.
Let me try a radical thought on you. I've thought this at times. I love teaching at Stanford. I love these really smart, able students that we get. They're amazing. They are really amazing. They have their problems. They have their anxieties. Almost all of them, male and female, black and white, almost all of them feel like imposters, right? Because they get there and they are suddenly in a really intense, really high pressure, big pond. And some of them crack and fail, but many of them thrive and learn new things about themselves. But let me ask, the radical question is, why are there these elite institutions in the first place? Right? Why are these that said we're only going to select a small sliver, and then the value of being in is so high, the social value of being in, of having the prestige associated with you, right? Because I think, well, wait a minute, can't I educate all comers in philosophy to some degree? Can't I educate all comers? I mean, it may be that I have the fast track, like in high schools, I have the fast track classes and the medium track classes and all that. But why are these what justifies these elite institutions as social goods, except we want to perpetuate the elite, and then we're going to fret over who gets to be part of the elite? I mean, why do we have these things?
Well, that's beyond the mandate of this program, but we can go there. We can go there to this extent. So I've got a public university in a big city like the City University of New York. Mm-hmm. One way of going is selective admissions, where I have people take tests and I look at their grades and I admit, quote, the best and the brightest. Another way of going is open admissions, where anyone who wants to go goes.
They did that in the old days.
Indeed, they did do. Some people think that led to the destruction of the culture of outstanding intellectual performance at City University of New York. Other people think it led to the democratization of it.
Right.
And I think you've got a conflict between two different kinds of values here. Clearly, elitism is productive if we just think about examples like scientific discovery or this kind of thing. These are virtuoso kinds of enterprises which most people are not equipped to pursue. And we do want to cultivate that. On the other hand, democracy is also an important value. And in a big city, I might think getting the masses of my people a public education is more important than creating a few scientists. But as long as I've got MIT, Princeton, and Caltech to rely on to do that for me.
Well, right. But see, once we make the social choice that we're going to have these elite bastions of elite of virtuosity, let's call it, right? Once we have these bastions that only appeal to the virtual, and we give, being one of those, high social payoff, high economic payoff, high cultural payoff, then we get into this intense war, because we're a democracy and not an aristocracy and not we get into this intense war about who gets there. And affirmative action can be a tool that says, let me in. let me in, even if I don't, because it's this pressure for a more democratic, more representative. Is that illogical? You said it's ironic, but I'm trying to kind of attack the irony here.
Well, look, there's nothing new here about there being outsiders and insiders. Look back in the history of the 20th century. Look at the ethnic diversity of the so-called white population. Look at the Jews, the Italians, the Irish.
Right.
The WASP who ran things at the turn of the 20th century weren't all that eager to admit these people. They didn't necessarily like the idea that they were coming along, but they couldn't keep them out. I mean, the Jews were discriminated against. We all know this history in the Ivy Leagues. The adoption of this idea of the well-rounded gentleman as the appropriate Ivy League student is in a way a reaction against the meritocratic pressure. Now, my point is this.
Yeah, okay.
Do we want African Americans to be uniquely distinct in the history of ethnic secession and assimilation in the society, whereas other groups actually, when the door gets opened, they get it themselves? But for African Americans, the door being opened isn't sufficient. What, at the end of the day, does that say about us?
Well, that says a lot of things, but it says a lot about our... Here's another thought I have. Tell me if this is crazy thought or not. Okay, I'm kind of divided mind. I usually don't speak my mind about these issues on the radio because I try to be the neutral host, but I'm kind of a divided mind, frankly, about affirmative action. I see it as an instrument of broader inclusion, and in a democracy, broader inclusion is a darn good thing. Not just one good thing, but a very, very good thing, right? Because it's a democracy. It has to have maximal buy-in. On the other hand, I think of it as a really late-stage intervention that's way too late, and our society is screwed up in lots of different ways. One of the, standardized testing, all that stuff that some opponents of affirmative action rail against, they were originally part of a progressive movement to get rid of hierarchy of class and all that sort of stuff. And if you got the goods, the test would show that you've got the goods, and you'd be able to. Now what's happened? Once the standardized testing regime, SAT courses and all that stuff and cram courses and all extra middle class, upper middle class parents invest tons of resources in making their kids more meritorious. That's a rational response to how things have gone. So African Americans, by and large, don't have the same resources to invest in the making meritorious of their children. That's not their failing. That's a failing of our society. So affirmative action isn't an answer to that. There's an earlier stage intervention.
You could call that earlier stage intervention developmental affirmative action if you wanted to. We're still in the business of fostering the success of African Americans in the case at hand. But the earlier stage intervention would avoid the issue where a person is less well qualified for an appointment and is actually getting it, because you're putting the foot on the scale on behalf of making that person qualified.
But I think you're both leaving out should African Americans get into the mainstream American society by a different route than these other groups did? Well, I think there are two distinct groups in American history, African Americans and Native Americans, who were treated horrendously for 2 or 3 centuries. Now, we didn't treat the Jews very well. They couldn't play golf. They were discriminated against in business. We didn't treat the Irish, like me, very well, so forth and so on. But these were minor league problems compared to what we did to Native Americans.
Well, that's certainly true.
And African Americans. So, yes, I think there should be affirmative action, and I think it should be of all kinds, what you call the weak affirmative action, which is thoroughly right, strong affirmative action, and then individual affirmative action by people who are sitting on committees and are aware that there's this racism and sexism that pervades the whole place, and when in doubt, they can give a little boost. That's my view.
The year is 2016. Mm-hmm. We're a half century more past the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's as long as from Appomattox to Versailles, practically.
Yeah.
That's a long time. How long, I ask, how long are African Americans supposed to rely upon a history of slavery as a narrative to give an account of contemporary events?
Well, it wasn't just slavery. It was Jim Crow and all that, the reintroduction of slavery by another name. So it's a complicated thing, but I want to let some callers in here. 1-800.
You're listening to an encore presentation of Philosophy Talk. The phone lines are closed.
And somebody from your neck of the woods, Michael in Boston's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Michael.
Hi, I feel compelled to mention that in the 80s, when as a Caltech student I was looking for off-campus housing, I went to an agency that rented, and I pointed to a spot on the map where there were a place I could afford, and they said, "Oh, you don't want to go there, that's Zululand."
Oh, wow.
So the past isn't past. I just wanted to say that in my training as a scientist and trying to teach people to be scientists, one of the things I have to emphasize is that no reading is absolutely accurate. That you can have precise readings, this person scored 790 on this exam, that person scored 740, but that doesn't mean that it's accurate, and that affirmative action within some reasonable estimation of the kind of error induced in trying to get a meritocracy, it seems perfectly reasonable. There was no perfect meritocracy to begin with, and all the methods we have of measuring merit are themselves somewhat inaccurate, so it doesn't bother me much. The other thing, though, I have to mention is that whenever something is done for a minority group, by definition, let's say that there are 4 mediocre white men for every mediocre black man, let's say on average. And, affirmative action is largely so that we can pluck excellence out of induced mediocrity. But the problem is that there are a bunch of people who will always say, "Oh, I didn't get that job because of this."
Yeah, Michael, I'm gonna thank you for the call. There's a lot of good stuff there. Glenn, want to respond to Michael?
Well, sure. There's racism still. That example about the housing discrimination is emblematic of the fact that there continues to be racism. I don't think that that's an argument for affirmative action. I think it's true, but I don't see that it's relevant. On the question of inaccuracy, let me just note that the inaccuracy applies when we're judging people within a racial group. If we have many white applicants and we can only select 10% of them, we're going to use the same inaccurate instruments. They're not perfect. They just happen to be the best we've got.
But I think his point is something like this. Sure, there's inaccuracy across all groups, but the inaccuracy enables you to say, even though this guy scored a little higher and this guy scored a little lower, in the interest of democratic diversity and inclusion, I'm going to go with the guy who scored a little lower. And if they took the test 10 times, it might wash out. I don't know, but, what's wrong with that?
We got to get down to cases now, because we're talking about what the mean and the variance of a random variable is. And so if it's close enough, the error of observation will make it a matter of little significance that we choose the person with the lower score. But how low is low? How big is big? We're talking about a 1 standard deviation difference at the mean between the performance on standardized intelligence and academic achievement tests of blacks and whites. But that's not a small difference.
I understand, but don't all universities have their the people who are in their 25th percentile, their 75th percentile, their 100th percentile? Is it a big deal if the minorities they're still in the range, but they happen to fall in the lower part of the range? Is that a big injustice?
Yes. Yeah, and in my mind, it's a big deal. I guess it gets down to our values. In my mind, having the African Americans cluster near the bottom of the class in the first-year law school curriculum is not a good thing. It's a stigmatizing thing. It equates race with mediocre performance within that setting.
So Glenn, given your reservations about affirmative action in a strong sense, do you see the underrepresentation of African Americans in universities as a problem that we need to solve? And if so, what are the options to affirmative action?
Don't answer the options. Answer the yes/no part, and then we'll go to a break, and then we'll get to the options.
Yes, I see a role for affirmative action in university admissions.
Okay, so you're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're thinking about affirmative action with Glenn Loury from Brown University.
In our final segment, we'll look to the future. Whatever the past rights and wrongs of affirmative action, what role, if any, should it have in the future? And what form exactly should it take?
The future of affirmative action, when Philosophy Talk continues.
Of course it matters if you're black or white. That's why we have programs like Affirmative Action. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I think Michael Jackson was just speaking for himself, and I don't think it mattered much to him. I'm Ken Taylor. Our guest is Glenn Loury, author of The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. And we're thinking about affirmative action and asking whether it's too little or too late. And we've got a caller in the line, Jabari from Berkeley. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Jabari.
First, I want to say thank you for this program, and I definitely will get Glenn Loury's book. Like you guys, I'm also a professor at a Research One institution, and one of the things I've noticed being on a ton of hiring committees is that it's not even a question of affirmative action sometimes when we get down to the final candidates to hire for a position. I've seen several instances of the top candidate being a candidate of color, being an African-American male, and then the dynamic in the hiring committee changes where now all of a sudden arguments are coming up for whether this is the right fit for our institution. So I think that affirmative action has has become a lens through which the extensiveness of racism in this country actually gets illuminated at a higher level. And so the question for me is one of, the notion of leveling playing fields and changing the power dynamics so that so people who are currently in power cannot just continue to perpetuate themselves.
Thanks for the call, Jabari. What do you want to say to Jabari, Glenn?
I think he's got a point. I mean, I'm thinking about my discipline of economics, which can, be construed in a number of different ways. One is a hyper-technical, we've got engineering and physics applied to society kind of view, and another is a much more qualitative, we're going to read ethnography, history, and political theory and try to think about how the country works in an economic sense. If I take that former, highly technical definition of the discipline, I'm likely to exclude a lot of people, women, minorities, and so on, who are relatively less represented at the upper echelons of quantitative and mathematical performance. If I take the latter, I'm likely to get a much more diverse. So there could be an argument about what is the discipline. And I can imagine a room full of incumbents who are going to be mostly male and mostly white, trying to think the discipline is what I do, and resisting the idea that we could rethink the discipline not only in the interest of ethnic or gender diversity, but also in the interest of being more effective at what we do.
I get your point. I think that's a really good point. I think all academic discipline, or many, certainly ours, faces this kind of question. But I want to put a different kind of twist on this because we're talking about the elite circles here when we're talking about the upper reaches, upper echelons of economic theories and economic science and elite universities and institutes and stuff like that. I still wonder something, though. Here's the thing that intrigues me. I don't think bugs it. It intrigues me. I think the number of whites who have been done assignable harm by affirmative action must be really rather small. I think the number of blacks, especially if you look around at society these days, the number of blacks who have been assignably benefited from this thing must also be kind of small because we're still in this business of the social hierarchies that blacks are excluded, whites get most of we're still. Why is this such a hot button issue given that the actual real world impact of it is minimal?
Well, let me just interject something. California eliminated affirmative action at the university. And you might think, well, that must mean at the top schools like Berkeley and UCLA, there must be a bigger percentage of whites to replace the African Americans that aren't getting in through affirmative action. But I don't think that's right at all. I think the big effect has been on Asians. I think the actual people who are suffering from affirmative action, if suffering is too strong a term, were not whites, but Asians. And so it's like a lot of things. The effects are not always what you think they're going to be.
There's a basic perceptual fallacy here, I think, with affirmative action, which I can illustrate with this example. Suppose 100 people apply and 15 are accepted. Mm-hmm. And suppose 3 seats are set aside for black applicants. Mm-hmm. That means that 85 people are going to be rejected. Now, each and every one of them thinks that they were the marginal applicant, that they were the one who would have been admitted but for those 3 seats. But that's only true of 3 out of 85 people. So to the extent that everybody anticipates that their rejection was because they just barely missed it, which is a generous assumption, but one that is pleasing to one's own self-regard, everybody is going to think of the whites who were rejected that they were rejected because of affirmative action, but it's true for a very small percentage.
So but the resistance to affirmative action then is partly, I don't know what you're going to, I don't know how to put this gently. It's partly born of perhaps unjustified white grievance. Because if all these whites say, look what I was denied, so that they could, but then very few blacks, these three blacks, benefit from it. See how strange politics is?
Indeed. And this is one reason why I advocate that we should not abandon affirmative action in the universities, but that we should expand its application beyond strictly racial minorities to include also some socially disadvantaged whites who might otherwise be able to do the job inside the university but wouldn't be selected.
Okay, Glenn, by the powers invested in me at Philosophy Talk, I'm going to make you czar of racial equality and inequality.
Oh, boy.
Your job is to heal our racial wounds. You have plenary powers. You can pass whatever laws you want, but you only get a day. So get busy. What are you going to do?
I think the most important thing that I could do if I had that kind of power, oh boy, what a world, would be to promulgate, because I'm czar, to promulgate a different conception of what we mean by equal educational opportunity. Ken was getting at this earlier when he said we're too far down the pipeline by the time we start rationing seats for admission to MIT or Caltech, and I think that's right. The idea of equal educational opportunity as it now exists, and some states have this written into their constitution, is that while local school districts vary in their ability to raise money from property taxes, the state should act so as to equate the resources available for every kid across every district. I think the principle, however, should be equal effective educational opportunity, not measured by the input, but measured by the output, so that to the extent that disadvantaged students require more assistance, support, help, and resources in order to be able to achieve the same effective educational chances, we would spend more, not the same amount, not less, but more on their education. And I think if we did that in the fullness of time, many of these issues would wither away.
So focus on pre-K through 12. Universities will probably take care of themselves if we do that.
Pre-K is very important to include in that. Focus on it like a laser. Focus on it with a vengeance. Focus on it with, a $500 billion national commitment to bring about effective, equal opportunity across different educational venues.
John in Oakland's on the line. He's got a suggestion for us of what we should be doing. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, John.
Hello, good morning, all. Very good conversation. There's a little bit of irony in what Ken said about Michael Jackson's song in the intro to this portion of the program. And when we're talking about affirmative action and we're talking about privilege, the kids of a Michael Jackson or a Bill Cosby, have every advantage economically and presumably educationally in this society that are not available to a lot of poorer people. My suggestion is that affirmative action has to be, as you were saying before, based on disadvantage, and that has to be class disadvantage. When we look at the rising death rates of former white working class people in middle America because they've lost their jobs, and essentially the whole economic strata has been eviscerated in this current economy for all kinds of classes and all kinds of races. It seems to me that it's most important that affirmative action evolve into bringing people forward that have just total economic disadvantage.
So, John, I'm gonna thank you because we're getting near the bottom here. I want to give Glenn a chance to answer, and maybe John too, because he said blacks have been uniquely disadvantaged. But Glenn, what do you think of this, John's?
I think John, the caller, has a point. I think that, however, class only and not race, if you run the numbers, would leave you with, because there are, after all, 7, 8 white people for every black person in the country, and there are plenty of lower working class whites, would leave you with a underrepresentation of African Americans that would be noticeable, which is why rather than getting into the class versus race argument, I prefer the class and race argument. let's expand our conception of affirmative action to include disadvantaged whites in certain numbers without giving up on a focus on race as well. I think that could be done. It would mean perhaps relatively fewer, not very, very low, but lower numbers of African Americans in certain settings. But I think we'd have a more robust and politically legitimate institution if we were to move in that direction.
I certainly take your point. I mean, I wish we're just getting started in a way. I mean, we could go on and on. I mean, we got so many problems, so many sources of inequality and disadvantage in this society, and I would like to remake this whole thing root and branch, to tell you the truth. But you can't remake it all.
I'm here until the end of May. Why don't you have me back and we can chew it over some more?
In my experience, it goes back to one of our callers. Lots of times when you're in decision-making in committees at universities and research institutes, you sense that there is, if you have 100 people in the whole apparatus of the university and one of them is a racist, that'll make a difference, right? People think racism is dead, but it's not totally dead, and those things can have a difference. If you have one letter in a tenure thing and you see this is an anti-feminist person, or this person's holding different standards, I think you have to react to that at an individual level. You don't have to get your institution out on the moral branch, but you yourself, if you sense it, you have to act. So that's affirmative action.
So, Glenn, I'm going to give you the last word, the very last word here. So, what you got? One last word for us? Briefly.
Let's not lose track of the morally compelling imperative that we want to become a colorblind society in the fullness of time. Let's be realistic. We are not that now. I'm not arguing a stick-figured policy argument that we should simply ignore race. But I'm saying while we go through this transition, let's not lose track of the fact that the goal here, the ultimate goal, is to make race a less and less significant factor in our public lives.
Now, that would be a really good thing to have happen. And, we got started on thinking about that today, but we didn't finish. But this conversation continues at Philosopher's Corner at our online community of thinkers, where our motto is, get this, cogito ergo blogo. You got it. I think, therefore I blog. And you too can become a partner in that community just by visiting our website, philosophytalk.org.
You can also follow us on Twitter. We're at PhilTalkRadio. Now, we've heard a lot about affirmative action. Let's hear a little bit about negative inaction. We got an expert on that. It's Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. Affirmative action has been making trouble for America since 1961. Originally, the term was not so fraught. Executive Order number 10925, signed by President Kennedy, provided that government contractors, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin, unquote. Affirmative action meant just say no to racial discrimination. Over the course of the next decade, there was a civil rights movement, and affirmative action came to include controversial elements like alleged and real quota systems for employment and school enrollment, which caused some white people to whine that they know this one guy who was a genius at everything and got a 4.0 in everything too, but he didn't get accepted at the big school because they had to have a black guy with a C average. Unfair. It's reverse discrimination is what it is. And affirmative action was unfair to black people, some white people insisted, because they weren't getting jobs or a university on their own merits. But on a history of crimes best left forgotten. Yes, there was a grumbling response to affirmative action. It happened pretty fast. Pretty quickly, affirmative action no longer meant, in the public mind, that workers would be employed without regard to race, but that race was the first thing you thought about when hiring people. And lo, there came onto America a backlash. California led the pack in 1996 with the passage of Proposition 209, the so-called California Civil Rights Initiative, which added a new section to the California Constitution, quote, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting, unquote. Maybe it was just me when I read it, but it seemed to pretty much say the same thing as JFK's executive order said, only back in the 60s the subtext was clearly don't discriminate against people of color, and the subtext of the 90s California proposition was don't discriminate against people of white. And today, 20-some years later, we see the backlash still when some people respond to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter, to which other people respond, oh, shut up. The 60s started to include women in the equal rights thing, and gays started to want to have rights too, and on to today when transgender people want to use the restroom and others don't like that one little bit. No, sir, no, ma'am. Other than that, on the rights front, many claim, no worries, racism is over. It does not matter what color you are, you cannot afford to go to college. Nobody can. So quotas don't matter anymore. Not exactly a win-win, but a lose-lose is a big step forward, isn't it? A rising tide lifts all boats, a hole in the hull, and we all go down together. Makes my heart stir just thinking about it. I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2016.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
The program is produced by Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is our director of research. Dave Millar is our director of marketing.
Thanks also to Merle Kessler, Mark Stone, Erica Topit, and Ted Muldoon.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University and the partners at our online community of thinkers.
And from the members of KALW San Francisco, local public radio, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you too can become a partner in our community of thinkers.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.
The American people don't need a law to stop them from discriminating. I mean, give them a chance and they'll do it on their own. That's why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Suggestion.